Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My guest for today is Dr. Richard Carrier. Welcome, Richard.
Yeah, glad to be on again.
I am so happy to have you. And just to give people a brief introduction of why I asked Dr. Carrier back, is I've been reading a lot of David Fitzgerald's books recently, Nailed and Jesus Mything in Action, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And now I'm ready
Yeah,
to start Volume 3.
yeah.
Um,
All good stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And David Fitzgerald cites Dr. Carrier as his source for a number of his points. And one of his points that I found particularly compelling, and not only compelling, but something I had never heard before, was a number of his first century historians that had Jesus been a real person, that we should have heard from them. And particularly two that I saw were Gallo and Seneca the Younger. And so I asked Dr. Carrier to come on and talk a little bit about some of this missing history.
Yeah. It's a good subject because, like you mentioned, like not a lot of people know about this. So I gotta do some background for people so we get you oriented. So I have a long discussion of this in my book, of course, on the historicity of Jesus, academic discussion. I go through example after example after example, and there are more examples, as I mentioned, than I even mentioned there. And today we'll go over a few of them, just a few like representative examples. But if you want to deep dive this, there's that chapter in that section. It's, chapter 8, section 3 and 4 has a lot of this.
And which book is this again?
On the historicity of Jesus, which
On
is the big, thick academic volume on whether Jesus existed or not. Now, it's important to note that I find that the silence of the record doesn't disprove Jesus' existence, as long as you admit the Gospels are lying, right? So, like, if the Gospels paint Jesus as this really super famous guy, like they literally say he was famous across all Syria, like a whole province, right? And they have him do a lot of really big public things, and you know, so if you believe the Gospels, then you have a problem, because there should be a lot more mentions of him in the historical record. Now, if he was a nobody, like a relative loser, he got a small fanatical following. You think of like the Heaven's Gate cult, right? Like today, like tiny little following, barely gets mentioned in the news 50 years later, that kind of thing. Then you could explain the silences. But even then, there's a lot of places that you might expect to have seen it, a discussion of it. And I'll go into those examples. But there is a difference between the ridiculous famous Jesus and the sort of mundane, not so famous Jesus that people might have missed or not cared about. And to give you a good example of that is, so Herod, right? So we have the murder of the infants, right? Like the famous nativity story, the murder of the infants. And there's more to that story that's even more famous. Like the Magi came and Herod got panicked. And like there's a lot of really public stuff that was happening, especially if you were Herod's court historian, like Nicholas of Damascus. And we know Nicholas of Damascus wrote a whole memoir about Herod's entire reign, right? So all the way up to 4 BC. And probably later, because he died like 10, 15 years later. So he probably continued the story, covering some of his sons and stuff. But anyway, it's a complete account. And we know Josephus used Nicholas of Damascus as a source. So you're thinking like the nativity, you know, obviously that's ridiculous. Mainstream scholars don't think that that's a historical event. You know, Jesus could still exist and not have had any of that famous birth stuff. But if you do think he had the famous birth stuff, well, then you have a problem, because Nicholas of Damascus would have been in court when the Magi thing happened, when the infants were ordered to be killed, when all of that happened. It would be recorded, and Josephus would have read it, and like, why would he leave it out? And he definitely doesn't mention it. Other historians also use Nicholas of Damascus, like Dio Cassius, and it's interesting that precisely the years in which Jesus would have been born, according to the calculations for Matthew, right? All of those years are mysteriously missing. Someone pulled them out of Cassius Dio, and we don't have them. And that could just be an accident, or it could be that, as some historians have suggested, people were embarrassed by the fact that he never mentions. He gives details on Herod's reign, but he just doesn't mention this, and that's embarrassing. So maybe we'll just make the books disappear, and then no one will talk about it, right? That kind of thing. And there's actually a more clearer example of that. There's a scholar by the name of Drews who wrote this study on Tacitus. So Tacitus, we have a missing middle of Tacitus because we have one manuscript that's the first part of it, and we have another manuscript, the second part of it, and then stuff in the middle we don't have it for. But even the first one, the first little bit of the book, is missing exactly 3 years right in the middle of it, which are the exact 3 years in which Jesus would have been executed by Pontius Pilate, in which Jesus' ministry would have happened, when his crucifixion would have happened, and all of that. And then, of course, all the Christian church would have, and the interactions of the government with the church, which are also very public and big in Acts. Like, they have whole armies being marshaled to guard Paul and things like that. So, like, the Romans are super involved in history. So it's almost certain that those 3 missing books never mention Jesus, never mention Christians. And that's why they got disappeared. The books got thrown away because it's better no one know that Tacitus didn't mention them. And we know from other authors who reference Tacitus that he didn't mention Christians in these missing volumes. So there's a lot of these suspicious things that are missing. We're missing 2 volumes of Hippolytus, who's this Christian anti-heretical writer in the early 3rd century. He says he's going to go through all of the mystery religions and debunk them. But the 2 volumes that immediately after that cover that are missing. So someone got rid of them. So something was embarrassing in there, right? Like, we don't know what exactly. Probably there's a lot of stuff that made Christianity look like a copycat religion, which is, they wanted to make that disappear. So there's a lot of these like missing things that are happening. But there's a difference here between the famous Jesus, which is the faux gospel story, and sort of like modern reconstructions of Jesus, who really wasn't that famous. Because that's the only way to explain the silence of the record, is that he just couldn't have been that famous. He must have just been like a minor figure compared to some other folks that were claiming to be a Messiah at the time. So keep that in mind as we go forward. But I'm gonna focus on a lot of these things that you don't know about, and we'll jump right to the one that you asked about, which is Gallo. So Gallo was the governor of a province, Greece, I think. I can't remember exactly, but the book of Acts has Christians, the apostles, actually up in trial before him. So he's actually making trial judgments about them and getting himself involved in their history. And now we don't know if Gallo himself necessarily would have written. It would be unusual. It actually would be unusual for an elite of his station not to write at least one book. That was kind of like de rigueur. Which means that, yes, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books that we don't have, because actually thousands. We know there's like thousands and thousands of books were written that didn't survive. And that's because the Dark Ages, people didn't have the money to preserve them. So most stuff got lost, right? And when Christians were making decisions as to what to spend their money on to keep, they chose Christian stuff, right? So there's not a lot of secular stuff got through that sort of bottleneck, essentially. Same as in the Byzantine Empire, too. There's a similar bottleneck where funding for preserving ancient literature was just basically shifted to funding for preserving Christian literature, and so we lost tons and tons of things. And another one of those examples, before I get back to Gallo, is we have Photius, who's this Byzantine Christian author who, in his day, had access to Justus of Tiberius's history of the Jewish war and the events leading up to it. And it was a history that covered the period of Pontius Pilate, just like Josephus covered the period of Pontius Pilate to explain the events that led up to the war. Justus of Tiberius did as well. And he was the right-hand man. He was the secretary to Agrippa, the same Agrippa that Paul goes on trial before in the book of Acts. So we have like Gallo, he's on trial in front of Gallo, who's, you mentioned, who's Seneca, the famous Seneca's brother. And then we have, in the same or a different trial in Judea, you have Herod Agrippa, and his secretary is Justus of Tiberius, who wrote this history. And we don't have it, right? We have Josephus hated it, and in his life he like wrote a tirade against Justus of Tiberius. They had some sort of beef against their differing accounts of what happened and why. But Photius had this book, and he read it, and he says that Jesus isn't mentioned in it. Justus of Tiberius didn't mention Jesus. So we know from Photius that book never. So Jesus was not famous enough to get on the radar of Justus of Tiberius. And then we're not going to go into it today, but people who look into the supposed reference to Jesus in Josephus looks to be a forgery. So even Josephus didn't really mention Jesus either. You can do a whole show just on that question by itself. But it's more telling that Photius tells us that it's not in Justus either. And so these kinds of things, you have all these little connections. Like Acts is kind of like this historical fiction that has Christians interacting with these famous people, right? But that actually suggests that they should be mentioned more, right? How would Herod Agrippa put this whole controversy? And by the way, Acts mentions an army, like the Romans send an army to go protect Paul, to bring him to trial. How could a trial that huge, that significant, not show up? And Justice was, he was the secretary to the guy who was there. How did that story not come up? So these are hard to explain, right? You have to kind of conclude that there was no army, that might not even been this trial. You have to kind of like throw away some of the history to explain why it didn't get mentioned. So back to Gallo, it was very common for elites to write books, and so lots of people probably wrote them, and we don't necessarily have references to them. We have references to a lot of books by a lot of obscure people and so forth that we don't have. So we know there's a lot lost by title, but we know there's even more lost that we weren't even told about, right? So it is possible Gallo would write something. Certainly, we should note that Gallo would have court transcripts. So they did do transcripts with shorthand. They had like synopses of court things. They had court judgments get filed. Names of people involved in the trial would be filed. So these records would exist. Now, we don't expect any of these records to survive, obviously, right? But they would have existed at some point. So like if a historian, say 50 years later, were looking into this, he could go, if he was of sufficient rank, if he was a senatorial rank, he could look into this. These records would probably be, you could go back and check them and stuff. So that there's these kinds of records existed a lot more than people realize. And we don't expect them to survive, but they would have been available at the time for writers to use. And this becomes relevant because Seneca did write books. He wrote a lot, and we have a lot of what he wrote. Not everything. We've lost even some of the things that he wrote, but we have a lot of it. And one of the things he wrote that we don't have, that we really, really, really wish we did, is he wrote a whole tirade, a treatise called On Superstition, where it was just a big, long tirade against basically crazy religious people. Like he every religion he could think of, he rants against it. And said some very interesting things. That we know this because Augustine, the Christian, the famous, Saint Augustine, mentions it. He quotes this. He mentions that Seneca wrote this treatise on superstition. He intimates that Christianity is not in there, basically. So in fact, Augustine's kind of annoyed that Seneca doesn't address it. He addresses Judaism, but he doesn't address Christianity.
Interesting. I guess one of the things that affected my conversion was, I can't even remember what sci-fi show it was, but some alien, when they heard what religion was, asked the person who explained it to him, "What's your superstition?" And
right.
I up until that moment, I had never even pictured religion as a superstition. And so it's interesting that even back then, a book on superstition would contain information on religions.
Yeah, and the back then words had slightly different valences. Superstition still had the same sense that we have today. It was a pejorative. It meant it was basically a way to insult religions that you thought were crazy, right? Like proper stately religion would be religio, but like crazy sorcery, woo-woo stuff of the lower masses would be superstitio, which is an excessive fear of the gods. So because that drives a lot of the superstitious, like strange behaviors and taboos and all of that are based on fear of spirits and how to like protect yourself from them, fear of God's wrath and how to protect yourself from it. And there's all these rituals and things you're supposed to believe or say or do to sort of like prevent the wrath of the gods from coming at you. That the elites did look down on that, and they called it superstition. And I said that's just a bunch of superstitious stuff. And we do have a treatise on this by Plutarch called On Superstition, where he makes a distinction. He says superstition is worse than atheism, right? This is how it's like at least the atheists are being rational, but the superstitious people are not. And so Plutarch gives this framework. He says there's atheism, there's religion, and then there's superstition. And then he describes his view of this difference is, which reflects the view of his social class, which was generally to have this sort of like more cerebral, more theological religion, less of the speaking in tongues and casting out demons kind of religion, right? So anyway, we know what these books kind of look like. And Seneca wrote one, and the piece that Augustine quotes is really fascinating in a lot of ways, because he talks about things like there were public hairdressers for the gods. So like Juno, even though it's a statue, it doesn't have hair. They would have hairdressers come out and pretend to do her hair every morning. And this was a part of a ritual for the Temple of Juno or whatever. And things like that we're like, that's interesting. We didn't know that they had those kinds of things. And so it clearly this book would have been great. We would have loved to have had this book, but it's also telling that Seneca never mentions Christians in it, as Augustine reports to us. And so we don't have the book, but we know that it doesn't mention them. And here's Seneca. This is the guy who's the brother of Gallo that Christians came upon him. And that superstition was a subject of that. Like the idea of, look, you guys have your weird religion. He would have said superstitions. It was all just a religious dispute. That's to him, right? Let's say this has nothing. I don't want to do anything to do with this. You go sort this out yourselves, right? That's how Gallo is presented in Acts as reacting to this. It's like, this looks like just a bunch of superstitious stuff. You guys go take care of it. It doesn't deal with the law, so I'm not interested. So you would think, like, if Christians were that, Seneca would obviously talk and share letters with his brother, and so they would know about this. And you would think that these things would be going on in other places. Like, aren't the Christians all over the place doing stuff? So why are they so, like, apparently they're so below the radar and so small that he didn't even notice them so as to write about them in his long list of rants against. I mean, he goes after the hairdressers of Juno. He can't go after the Christians. And that's because he didn't know about them, right? So that tells you something about that Christianity at that time was so below the radar, so small, did not have a lot of followers. It was not a big deal.
When was he writing again?
This would have been between 40 and 60. So the same time that Paul is writing, right? And the same time that Paul would be up in trial in the book of Acts, right? So it's the same period of time that's happening. So that's an example of what I was talking about. Let's see. What is there anything else I missed? I kind of bounced around there. So and I covered examples of Jewish writings like Justus of Tiberius, examples of secular writings like Seneca, where we would expect this stuff, where there would be thousands of times more literature then than we have now. And that will include books, but also documents. So I mentioned like court documents, but there also be personal letters, contracts, all kinds of things that would exist. And we have examples in the book of Acts. So the book of Acts mentions 2 written documents that we don't have that we would like to have, if they're real. They're probably made up. But the first is the charging document. This is probably the most important document we could ever have. When Paul goes after the Christians, right? He's given letters by the Jewish elite to go persecute the Christians. And those are the charging letters that listed whatever crimes that they were supposed to be pursued for, and presumably the evidence of the crimes or whatever. Like, that would have been super handy, right? Like, to have the charging document say, this is what they were accused of. So that would tell us like what the beliefs were. It would almost certainly mention Jesus as a recent historical convicted felon, right? Like, that would be a part of the whole story. But we don't have that document, but supposedly it existed, right? If the Christians were being pursued in courts of law, there would be charging documents. They should exist somewhere. We actually have a quotation of the charging document of Socrates. So we actually have examples of these documents, and we've actually recovered them, examples of them for nobodies in Egypt, because a lot of papyri, Egypt is so dry. A lot of papyri survived there, especially the garbage dumps. They basically just dried out and became these fossils of thrown away trash. And so that would include like thrown away, memoirs and court documents and things like that weren't needed anymore, or were fading out, and they copied them and they're using the copies, but they throw the old ones away. So we have charging documents for ordinary Egyptians, for example. But the climate in Judea wouldn't preserve this, or in Greece. And the only exceptions to this, is interesting, is that we have a Greek politician who is someone like Gallo. He's not Gallo, but he has a similar rank and activity. And he retired to Egypt and brought a chest full of his entire life's dossiers, all the documents and letters and stuff for his whole entire career. And his house burned down, and the chest got buried in the debris, and we recovered it. And this is roughly around the same time. We're talking first AD-ish, give or take. And so that's Greek documents, but they survived because they were in Egypt. So it's possible for these things to survive like that. It's just we don't expect it to. But they would exist, right? And so like 1st century authors, 2nd century authors might have had access to them, or could have gotten access to them if they were the right rank and could travel and all these other things. So anyway, that's an example of. Another one is the letter of Claudius Lysias, which is quoted supposedly in the book of Acts. The quoted letter doesn't look anything like an actual letter would look like of this type. It's an ambassadorial letter, basically a letter of introduction, where Claudius Lysis writes to the court saying, this guy, there's this dispute concerning this guy. People were trying to kill him. That's why I'm sending him with soldiers, right? So he sends an army with him. Now, the charging document, the actual ambassadorial document would have had the full name, the full Roman name of Claudius Lysis. It would have had Paul's full Roman name. It would have had a more detailed description of what the hell's going on. Right, exactly. So we would have, if we had the real letter, and it would have the date that it was sent by regnal year. They usually put like the 5th year of Claudius or whatever. It would have a date on it. So if we had the actual letter, now that's why we can suspect that the letter that shows up in Acts is made up, because it doesn't look like a real letter. A real letter would have all these other details and it'd be written differently. That's because we have examples of letters like this from Egypt, for instance. So anyway, that would be an example of the kind of document that we should have if that ever happened. Now, we can deny that happened and say that's all made up and still accept that there was a Jesus, because the existence of Jesus doesn't depend on Paul being defended by an army. But it gives you an example of the kinds of stuff that would exist that people could get their hands on. And supposedly the author of Acts is claiming that he got his hands on these documents too, right? I think he's lying, but he claims to be able to. So why couldn't they, right? That's the kind of thing. Now, all of that said, so those are the different kinds of categories of things. There's another thing that I should mention, which is Herculaneum. I did a whole article on this recently. You can check on my blog. There is a whole library, ancient library, that was buried in 79 AD, and it's still there. The books are there. They're charred. They're buried under ash. There's a variety of reasons why we haven't dug them up yet, but they're there, a whole library. And we've already captured some of these, and there's some very fascinating things that we're finding out of them. But the thing is that this was buried in Herculaneum because of Vesuvius. So Vesuvius erupted in 79. The pyroclastic flow just completely wiped out Pompeii. So people are aware, they know that story. That pyroclastic flow would have basically dissolved everything. So there would be no books. There was probably a library there, but it would have been vaporized. So we wouldn't have that. But Herculaneum was gradually buried slowly under ash. So the library baked. It just sat there and baked so that the scrolls are still there, but they're charcoal now. And we have the technologies now to use a computer to read them and stuff like that. So we can do this. This happened recently. So they did in the 19th century, they tried to do it by hand to break them up and do a puzzle read and stuff like that. And they gave up because it was a bad idea. They gave that up, but it was a bad idea. But recently, technology has been developed to use particle accelerators to basically rake them with X-rays and use computerized axial tomography to create a 3D map of all the ink in there. Now, the ancient ink didn't use iron, so the old techniques were to do this with iron to find the iron molecules, because medieval manuscripts use iron-based ink. But they came up with a way to do it without iron-based. It was carbon-based ink is what was used on these scrolls. But they came up with a way to do it, and so now they can read them. And they're using programming and AI to decipher this text. So they don't even have to unroll these anymore. They can just scan them, and they've got a complete 3D picture of all the marks everywhere throughout the roll, right, throughout the scroll. And then they can so they're already now starting to untranslate some of these. And so that's very interesting. But there's the whole library there. So what could be there? And I wrote an article about things that would be there that I would really love to find and that have a good chance of being there. But one of the things to note is that Vesuvius, that's when Pliny the Younger was the naval commander near Pompeii. And when the volcano went up, he marshaled the fleet to try and run a rescue operation. He tried to rescue people. And he was overcome by fumes and died. And that's when Pliny the Elder, that's when he died, leaving all of his inheritance and his publishing and his books and everything to his adopted son and biological nephew, Pliny the Younger. And Pliny the Younger, you may know, if some people may know, is the first person that we know for sure wrote about Christians, because it's the letter of about 110-ish AD. He writes to Trajan saying, hey, these people being accused to me called Christians. I don't know what crimes they're guilty of. How do I try them? I don't know what I'm doing. Give me some guidance. And Trajan writes a little letter back saying, mostly just ignore these people. They're not a problem. But when you read the whole letter of what's going on, it's clear that Pliny the Younger decides to try them for illegal assembly. So they, in America, we have the Second Amendment, or I'm sorry, the First Amendment that has the right to assembly. And that's weird. So like before that happened in history, normally you didn't have that right. So like if you started a club for anything, golf club, doesn't matter, the government gets suspicious, right? It's like, I don't know what you're really doing here. And so they basically require you to get a license from the state to assemble. And so the state keeps their eye on you and make sure you're not doing something political. And this got so bad that in Bithynia, where Pliny the Younger was governor at the time, it was so bad. This is a completely different letter, but he wrote to Trajan about a different problem, which is that Trajan had banned even firefighting clubs, in other words, firehouses, because they were clubs and they were politically organizing. So he banned the firefighters. And Pliny writes, he says, well, we've got cities burning. Like, what do we do? And Trajan comes back and says, well, improvise, right? Is basically his response. But that's how concerned they were about illegal assembly, that even something is super useful and important as assembling to like run a firehouse to police fires in a city, like even that they were like suspicious of and preventing. So Pliny kind of comes down on the Christians for that, not for their superstition. It wasn't illegal. They didn't care about anything that they believed. Their beliefs were irrelevant. It was just their illegal assembly. They weren't getting a license from the state in the way that, for example, Jews were. So the Jews could assemble at synagogue because they have a license from the state to do that. Well, the Christians were bypassing that, and that was what they got. That's what got them in trouble. But in this letter, Pliny says, like, I've never been to a trial of Christians. I have no idea what they're guilty of. I don't know what they believe. I don't even know why why people are accusing them to me. Like, what am I even supposed to do? Now, this is important because that means that his father, whose books he published and loved, he beloved his father's writings, Pliny the Elder. That means Pliny the Elder's history. Pliny the Elder wrote this huge history of Rome, including Nero, the reign of Nero. And Pliny the Elder was there. He was an eyewitness during the burning of Rome and during the supposed what would have been, according to Tacitus, we think, or not, the Christians were scapegoated supposedly for burning Rome, or actually did it. I mean, the text we have actually suggests they confessed. But whatever you think, the story is that Nero blamed Christians for the burning of Rome, and this was a big deal, and he had made a big spectacle over their murders in arenas and stuff like this. And if that's the case, Pliny the Elder was there. And he would have recorded all of this. He would have said, this is who was accused. This is why they were accused. This is why people hated them or whatever. He would have mentioned what they believed, etc. So if that had happened, Pliny would have written it down. And if Pliny had written it down, the younger Pliny would have read it. And so when he wrote his letter to Trajan, he wouldn't have said, I don't know what these people are guilty of. He would have said, hey, these are the people who burned down Rome. Like, what the hell am I supposed to do? Like he would have mentioned, right? He would have known something because his father wrote about it. So the fact that in his letter, Pliny shows that he knows nothing about Christians, nothing at all, means that his father didn't write about it, which means that they were not persecuted by Nero for the fire. Like that's a whole made up story. So that tells us something that's all bogus. Now, it could have gone the other way, right? It could have gone the other way. If that story was true, then we should have, Pliny the Elder would have had us a detailed, very early record. He would have been an eyewitness in the 50s and 60s. He would have been writing in the 70s AD. That's really close.
Do you know when the earliest writing is about this being an event?
Oh, it only occurs one place that isn't derivative of it, which is Tacitus. So
okay,
this has led to a lot of literature lately, especially lately, of historians coming up with different hypotheses. One is that the event didn't happen and Tacitus made it up. Another is that my theory personally, and I've published peer-reviewed studies on this, is that it was originally about Christians who were Messianic Jews, not Christians, our people, right? It wasn't about Jesus. It had nothing to do with that. And the line that says Jesus, who was executed by executed by Pontius Pilate under Tiberius, that one line is probably a scribal interpolation. It was probably a marginal note that got inserted into the text during copying. And so the passage was never about Christians originally, and it becomes about it later. And we have the next earliest reference would be the fourth, and Tacitus is early 2nd century. The earliest next reference would be early 4th century of what's called the forged correspondence of Seneca, the one we were just talking about, and Paul. So someone faked an entire correspondence that this Seneca and Paul supposedly shared letters together. It's complete forgery, completely faked in the 4th century. But it mentions this. It mentions the fire, but it says Jews were the culprits and Christians were accidentally swept up because they were mistaken as Jews. And that's interesting because that would align with my theory that the original scapegoats were the Christians, who were these basically Jewish rioters. They had nothing to do with Christianity. And so it would have been Jews who were swept up. And so someone who forged that sort of came up with this, well, what if I have the Christians get mistaken for Jews and get included in that? And now we have something that Seneca and Paul can talk about in their letter. So I think that's where the story actually originates, is the forgery in the 4th century. By the end of the 4th century, it's we see that this story has taken hold. And so everybody's just assuming that that's what Tacitus is talking about. The earliest that we have attestation of the line, the suspect line that I think wasn't in Tacitus originally, the earliest attestation of that is Middle Ages. It goes way, way, way out before we know that that was showing up there. And yeah, sorry. we live on a hill, and so we have a lot of people with fancy engines who want to gun up the hill. So that's why occasionally you get that. I apologize for that. But so where was I? I was talking about.
You were talking about Tacitus and
where the story came from. So anyway, yeah, that's the possibility of that, right? But of course, Christian apologists want it to be true because it's part of their, their legend, their mythology, that the great Neronian persecution for the fire, like whole movies were made about this. So like they want that to be true, but it's looking like it's not. And we can tell that from Pliny the Younger's letter, because Pliny the Younger's letter tells us it wasn't in Pliny the Elder and his history. And if it wasn't in his history, it didn't happen. So, and now the thing is that book would not be at Herculaneum because it was published after his death. But there were tons. I go through the names on the Historicity of Jesus, tons of historians, women and men, who wrote books.
Really?
Many. Oh yeah. Agrippina, her memoirs were so important that lots of historians like Tacitus relied on them later. So, so we have a lot of that, right? Well, we don't have it, but we know it existed, and you can go through the list, and some of them overlap. Many of them overlap the year 64, which would have been this. They're writing about the reign of Nero. They would have covered the fire, and a lot of those guys would be at this library. Could be there now, like sitting right now in Italy under ash. It's turned into stone now, but it could be there. These historians who were there, who tell us the account of what really happened. So in theory, like if it really was Christians, there could be an attestation of Jesus and their story and their beliefs in a scroll somewhere in Herculaneum right there. They're just waiting for us to dig up. I suspect not. I suspect if we find it, it'll just be the Christians, the Jewish rioters. I don't think it'll have anything to do with Christianity, and it'll be missing again. But it could have been there. If Jesus was famous, definitely he would be there. So that's just an example.
Joel Peterson's comment here is quite, in going with what you're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
This is fun fact. There's a Tacitus manuscript where the E of Christians was erased and replaced with an I for Christians. The original E shows up in UV light.
Yes. So it's worse than that. There is only one manuscript. And that is the case for that one manuscript. It originally said Christians, and someone erased it and copied over and tried to fix it to make it say Christians. There's a lot of possible explanations for that. I won't go into it here, but they're right. That is actually the case. And that tells us something. That gives us a clue to what's really going on here, I think it's we have a reference to Chrestus, who started riots in Rome, Jewish Messianic riots in Rome it's mentioned in Suetonius. It would have been in the sections of Tacitus that would have covered the reign of Claudius that we don't have. So I think that's what the story is really about. I think Tacitus is writing about the Christians, who were this sort of Messianic Jewish movement and were militarists. They weren't Christians in our sense. So I think it's entirely plausible. So, I think I've just kind of gone through a bunch of examples. I could keep going, but but I have many more interesting examples that you'll find in that section on the historicity of Jesus. And I think it's important to go through that to see like what kinds of things existed that Jesus could have been mentioned in. And so it's worth doing. And yeah, there's a lot more than people realize. People are often surprised by this.
Okay. Well, As long as we're paused, I've got some questions that I've been holding, and we'll go
Yeah,
ahead.
let's do it. Let's go in. Yeah.
Okay. The first one is, what is the likelihood that we have the exact words of any biblical character, including Jesus? It seems implausible.
I'm not entirely sure what this means. So, like, if Paul's
Well, like,
writing his letters, then those are the exact words of Paul,
mhm.
with some signal distortion, because there's the preservation rate for textual transmission. You have a certain rate, like 1 out of every 200 verses is going to be, or actually, it's what, like more like 1 out of every 20 verses is going to have a defect in it. But generally, yeah, you could have the authentic words of Paul, even the authentic words of Jesus. So, like, Paul quotes his personal conversation with Jesus in his mind, but he thinks it's really Jesus. He's talking to Jesus in his mind. This is dead Jesus, by the way. And he's having an argument with Jesus about whatever the thorn in his side is, and won't you remove it, etc. There's a lot of debate over what the thorn is. But the words of Jesus are quoted there by Paul, and that's probably, I'll bet that's an exact quote of the voice in his head. I'll bet that's it, right? Of course, that's not Jesus, really, right? So I don't know if that qualifies, but in terms of other characters, do we have the exact quotations? I think the answer is probably no. And I'm on the sort of extreme end of skepticism there, but there are a lot of scholars who are with me there on that. There even apparently there's now some like mainstream scholars who are doubting that Paul existed.
Yeah, I was
Right,
wondering
so
about that. I've started to hear that.
Nina Livesey just did a major peer-reviewed study. It's not crank, like she's making. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced by her argument, but she's into the mainstream, so it is not a fringe theory anymore. But anyway, yeah, there's a lot of challenges being made to the authenticity. And I think, like the sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, let's take the Gospel of Mark, for example. Mark is taking Paul's writings, Paul's teachings, and putting them in the mouth of Jesus, telling stories in which Jesus enacts the moral that Paul taught, right? So everything's made up. And in the same book, on the historicity of Jesus, I have a section where how Dale Allison shows that the Sermon on the Mount was clearly fabricated, probably by the authors of Matthew, after the Jewish war. That Jesus never said any of that. It's all fabricated after the fact. So yeah, I think it's legitimate to doubt that we have any recorded sayings, apart from Paul himself. In that
Okay. Supreme Scientist clarified a bit. He says, I don't think we have a perfect, unaltered original manuscript of Paul. Aren't we relying on copies of letters of Paul transmitted over centuries as well?
Correct. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And like I said, the error rate is fairly high. So I've done some statistical numbering. Like the rate of interpolation is something like 1 out of every 200 verses in the Bible was added later. It's something, and it's probably higher. The rate is probably higher than that, but that's at least that, given the evidence that we have, because we can look at we have thousands and thousands of manuscripts over hundreds of years. We can see the interpolation and error rate, so we know the error rate, and we can extrapolate that back into the 100 years in which we have no manuscripts, and we know error rates were higher in the first century of a manuscript's transmission than later, for a variety of reasons. And so yeah, there's a lot of signal distortion. So I think at least 1 out of every 20 verses is inaccurately preserved in some way or other, but most of those ways are trivial, like word order or something, that don't really change the sense. Most of the errors are spelling mistakes that can be you can tell that it's a spelling mistake, and so you're not misled. But some of those spelling mistakes lead to errors in reading. And one of the famous ones that I like is in the Gospel of Luke, with everybody on nativity plays talks about the peace on earth and goodwill toward men. That's what the nice thing no, that's actually a spelling mistake. A single letter accidentally got switched, got left out. One letter, and it changes it. When you go back earlier, you can see in the original text, it says it's peace on earth in whom God has goodwill. So it's a much more ominous and dark statement, basically. It's like, fuck everybody else. But the ones that I like, they'll have peace, not anybody else, right? So it's a much more, dark Jesus saying. dark Yahweh or whatever. Dark Metatron.
Along these lines, how old is the oldest manuscript that we have of Paul's writing?
So complete manuscript would be the early Bibles like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, which are the 4th century. We have incomplete bits. So we have kind of like, let's say, half a book or so of various examples. Like they're incomplete, but they're pretty large sections from the 3rd century. And then we have from the early 3rd century, like roughly 200 AD, plus or minus 15, 25 years, we have a million little tiny postcard snippets. It might be a few sentences. But really, we've not confirmed. There's a new book out by Brent Nongbury called God's Library, and he goes through and he kind of redates all of this stuff using, non-confessional assumptions. The tendency has been in scholarship to date these things earlier than they should be, because that's more of the triumphal narrative of Christianity. Christian apologists need the fragments to be early. Nongbury says that scientifically, objectively, that those dates are all wrong. We can not securely date any manuscript earlier than 200 AD. And maybe at most 150, but that's stretching the limits of the accuracy of our dating methods. And even that would be high speculation. Most of the stuff seems to date around 200 AD plus minus a little bit. So we don't have anything. We basically have about 100, 150 years of silence where we don't get to see any manuscripts. And that's a long time in a superheated propagandistic environment. And we know it was because the first Bible was Marcian's. Our Bible is the response Bible. So our Bible's been edited to respond to his, and his was edited to sell his thing, which is his weird new religion. So it's the version that we have has been gone through the grinder of propagandists over and over again. So the error rate is even higher, and tracks deliberate distortion more than any other text that we know. Like no one's doing this kind of grinder on Tacitus. There's a lot of errors through transmission in Tacitus, but they're not ideologically driven. Tacitus didn't go through the grinder of 100-year-long ideological propaganda war, right? So you would trust the text way even less after that, had that been the case. So yeah, we should be super skeptical of the reliability of the transmission. I don't think you can just assume that anything you're looking at is false, but you can't, like the way I put it is, if even Tacitus, like Tacitus is lightly edited compared, even Tacitus, if Tacitus's annals were instructions for building a rocket, I would not get on that rocket, right? Like that's it's like we trust him, 90%, right? And it's like that's fine for most history, but that's not fine for religion, because if you're going to say 90%, I don't know, that's 10% chance you're wrong. Like if you're going to base your whole life on this, right, you can't, right? So and so the Bible is even worse than that. And so I think even though as a historian we could say, yeah, probably this is what it said, but as a religious guide, you're putting your hands in, you're trusting it too much. Like the textual distortion, especially deliberate ideological distortion, is too high for you to be that confident that you would need to be for that. So it's different for a religious perspective versus historians. Like we're fine, more probable than not, we're fine with that. But you can't do that with religion, right? If you're going to base your life on this, even down to the specific parsing of the specific tense of a specific verb, as you see a lot of biblical exegetes are like building entire ideologies out of these little things. And like, I don't know, like that's a really shaky enterprise.
Okay. Jesus Tale says, love your work. What do you think of Dr. MacDonald's 6 criteria of mimesis? I'm not sure how you pronounce that.
Mimesis or mimesis. Both are correct. Yeah.
I found them fruitful in analyzing Elisha as a reworked.
Yeah, as a reworked. That's a reference to Brodie's work. Thomas Brodie did some fantastic work, and it's been picked up by MacDonald as well. So he repeats it in his synopses. Dennis MacDonald has this great book called The Synopses of the Gospels. I think it's the Gospels, Acts, and Greek literature. I can't remember. Just MacDonald's synopses. Look for that. It is the best resource for this. It covers everything, both Jewish mimesis, pagan mimesis, all in the Bible. And one of the things is Thomas Brodie, who was actually one of his mentors, showed that a lot of the Gospel of Luke is just a rewrite of the Elijah-Elisha narrative in the books of Kings. And it just updates it, basically like takes the story. It's like taking Romeo and Juliet and update it into gangs in New York and calling it West Side Story, right? That's the same kind of thing as they did with Jesus. They updated the setting, put Jesus in the role, made him be better, like he's better than Elijah and Elisha. And he documents this, and he uses a particular set of criteria for when you can show that the target text is actually being emulated, and it's not we're not just seeing things in the tea leaves. It's not a illusion. You can actually argue that no, it's very improbable that the text would look this way unless they're emulating the target text. And for doing that, he had 6 criteria. And the way he modeled it is like the more and stronger it meets those criteria, the more confident you can be that emulation is occurring. And this works for pagan literature, it works for Jewish literature. It doesn't matter which author you're analyzing, whether it's pagan or biblical. It doesn't matter what the target text is, and so on. You can use the criteria that way. I actually, in Proving History, so my book Proving History, which is on methodology, I have a whole section where I show that his criteria are mathematically correct. So I actually show like what is the mathematical logic that makes his criteria valid, and how would they work and not work, etc. And so I have a whole section on that. No, he's totally right, and he's building on Thomas Brodie. So the criteria start with Brodie. MacDonald kind of perfects them, and then I did a logical analysis showing that the method is logically valid. And so obviously I think highly of it, and I think it can be applied in a lot of different ways.
Okay. Yeah, I should have brought this up earlier because this is the continuation of the same question, which was, let me bring the other one back. What do you think of Dr. McDowell's 6 criteria? I found them fruitful in analyzing the Elijah Elisha Esri worked. Moses, Jesus, accessible analogy, diversity, order, distinctive traits, and interpretability.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Next, Mark Rothenberger, thank you for your support. Asked, does Galatians 1:11 and 1:12 boast mythicism or not? Calling Jesus not a man seems suspicious, even if dead, right?
The short answer, okay, so against evangelical Christianity, the evangelical Christian Jesus, yeah, it definitely doesn't comport with that. But you can make it work. So there are versions of historicity in which the understanding is that Jesus was only a man temporarily, right? He wore a human bodysuit just long enough for it to get killed, and then he ejects, and now he's back to being a celestial being. So he's not a man anymore. And he wasn't a man before, right? He was this archangel from the beginning of time, and he descends into this bodysuit, gets killed, and then leaves. So in that model, and which is totally compatible with the historical Jesus, in that model, that just means that Paul believes this about Jesus, that he was only a man temporarily. But he did come from outer space. He did assume the body. He did die, but then he, ejected back to a celestial again. So that passage doesn't conclusively argue for mythicism, but it is very compatible with mythicism, obviously.
Okay. All right. Ember asks, is Dr. Carrier thinking of debating again one of these days? The old ones are super fun to watch.
Yeah. I'm kind of tired of it, to be honest. So the short answer is yes, I will. It's just I charge a lot now. So if you go to my booking page, you'll see I have a rather high rate right now for debates, and that's probably going to chill most people off. The reason is that most debates, especially live debates, I want to make an exception for written debates because I think those can be really fruitful, and I do those much more affordably. So if people want to do a written debate, but she's talking about entertainment value, so that's clearly not the written debate. You're talking about the orals. I find that they're just game shows, basically. So it's just my opponent, whoever it is usually just they're disingenuous. They're not going to be a good faith actor. They're just trying to use emotional rhetoric. They're trying to game the system, and so it's just a game, right? We're just playing a game. And I'm just kind of sick of that. I don't think it's productive. I understand it's fun because I've been doing it so long, I'm good at it. And so I can easily catch the games they're playing and like really describe them to the audience, in real time. And so like people do like that. It's just, I'm tired of it. So I need to be paid a lot now. That's the only way I'll do live debates. Which, does mean if you want to like pull together a GoFundMe and like fund some big debate you want to do, you can go check out my rate and see who would debate me. There are a few people I will never debate, and those are the people that I think are completely angry, dishonest debaters. Like I'm not going to engage. You got to have at least some sort of seriousness in your debate if I'm going to debate you now. And so, but apart from that, if you can find anybody who'll do like a serious attempt to debate something and you can meet my rate, I'll do it. And so, but that's if that doesn't happen, then I no, I won't. So
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know if I have no current debates planned. A few have happened at my high rate, so it can happen. It just depends on who wants to fund it.
Okay. This question is from Joey, and I should explain who Joey is. Joey is my troll, and he usually is always off topic, but this time he has a question that is exactly on topic, so we will address it.
Yeah.
And that is, you mentioned earlier that you wouldn't get on a rocket ship that was designed by Tacitus, based on the writings of Tacitus,
Right.
because it's only 90% accurate.
Right.
And so, would you base your religion or your life on something? So Joey responded with, what should people base their lives on?
Yeah. Well, the first lesson in this is epistemology. So you're going to start with a reliable epistemology, and then you're going to make a hierarchy of beliefs based on confidence. So you're going to admit when you don't know something very confidently, and you're going to base your life on the fact that you don't know it confidently, right? Rather than pretend that you're confident in a thing that you're not. And what this results in is like very well-established science is going to be the bedrock of your thing, because that's the stuff that's been proven to the highest degree of confidence. Not all science, just like the best established science. And then you go from there with sound, valid, evidence-based reasoning. And then you build from there. Where do you end up when you do this? I think you end up with secular humanism and metaphysical naturalism. And that's my whole book. Sense and Goodness Without God is literally that. Like, this is what you should base your life on. And if it's not this, then what that book shows you is how to build a better one. Like, if you think I'm wrong, it gives you all the tools and the directions you need to go in to build a better one. You should build your own worldview out of evidence and reason, and not rely on like this sort of divine word kind of thinking, which is not going to work for you. So that's my answer to that question. Does that mean that it's harder work? Yeah, there is no simple solution. There is no God who's going to like give you the 9-line on how to live your life. Like, unfortunately, that doesn't exist. So you can't count on that. You've got to do it yourself. And it does require work. It does require effort. It does require critical thinking. It requires becoming comfortable with doubt. Like, there's things there are always going to be things you're not confident about. And so you're going to have to build their decisions around your lack of confidence rather than trying to pretend that you're not confident. So anyway, that's the short answer to that. But Sense and Goodness Without God is a place to start. I have lots of articles on my blog too, where I explore these things. Like if you're interested in morality, if you're interested in meaning of life, I've got articles on all of this stuff.
I have one of your blog pages starred to read later that I really want to get into and read, and it is on morality.
Oh, do you remember the title?
No, I don't. I just
okay.
I saw it pop up in my email, and so I starred the email. I said, I want to read that as soon as I have time.
Yeah, that and politics, right? Politics is very important. So if you want to because politics affects other people. So how you vote or don't vote, like, that impacts lives. And so I think people need to be more serious about their evidence-based reasoning and deciding that. And so that's where you get into the same philosophy.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the super chat, Mario. And the question is, do you you do realize that having Nietzsche level psychotic episodes, including Ezekiel like visions, while taking your naturalism class, right? It really made me feel like I understood St. Paul.
Yeah, well, hopefully the takeaway though is to be more skeptical and critical, but of even that. My first article that I ever wrote was on something similar. It was about someone had written an article about Buddhist meditation and how they can gain insights about the world through, technically hallucination. They're talking about like getting into higher states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness, and having experiential events, which I have done as well. I've had through Taoist meditation. I have a backstory on that. And I wrote an article about how to critically react to that. Like, you don't have to just dismiss it. You can still learn things, but you have to like limit what you can learn based on your understanding of what's actually happening, right? And so that was my first peer-reviewed article, was on the epistemology of hallucination. It was actually epistemology of religious experience, but it's the same principles apply to anything like that.
Okay, very good. Joel Pearson says, I took Carrier's metaphysical naturalism course when I left religion. It was well worth it.
Yeah, I'm always glad to hear that. Because that's kind of the reason I get those things out there, is I hope they can help somebody. Also, I hope somebody can make it better. That's always a good hope too. But no, I'm always glad to have been helpful.
Okay, we are getting close to the end of the show. So are there any final remarks that you would like to make? Anything you'd like to, you think we may have missed at this point?
No, I think we covered all the bases. People who want to know more about that, what books to look for. If you go to my website, richardcarrier.info, that's just my name, .info. You'll find
that is linked in the description. There is a link to your website in the description.
Right, and that'll have all my social media links. If you want to know how to follow me on social media, I have a guide to my social media on my blog, so you can search my blog for Guide to Social Media. I'm on Blue Sky. That's my favorite right now. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. And I also have a guide to my books. So if you want to what book should I start with? Or if you want to look through all of my books, I've got a whole article that talks about the books that I've done. And then, of course, through my website, I also teach courses on a lot of subjects, philosophy and history. So check those out. And my blog, which is, a lot of, I think I've been really happy with the last 5 years of production on my blog. The articles are pretty good. And I'm happy with they're written on things that I thought needed to be written and exist, and now they do. And so I'm happy with them. I think people will be pleased as long as you're comfortable with long form blogging, because I'm one of the weird dinosaurs in the world who makes a living doing long form blogging. It's almost a lost art. But that's what's going on there amidst all the other stuff.
Okay. And Kristen Hood, thank you very much for the super chat. Thank you for having Dr. Carrier on. His Jesus from Outer Space is now available on Audible.
Yes. I don't have time to read my books anymore. So all my books are read by me, except that one, Jesus from Outer Space, and all future books are read by Casey Gleason now. And she does a really fantastic job. So my audiobooks are going to come out more. Like Jesus from Outer Space took forever to come out on audio because I kept dragging. And then I realized I just could never do it. And so I got someone to do it. And so we split the royalties on Audible. So she gets a share if you buy the Audible version of Jesus from Outer Space. And the same will be the case in forthcoming books. So yeah, check those out. If you like listening to books, all my books are Audible now.
Cool. And for anyone who doesn't know who Casey is Godless Engineer's wife.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming. It has been an absolute pleasure having you on. My guest for next week is going to be Wild Man Chris. And that's going to be a little bit different show. He is a fairly new atheist, and he's having difficulty letting go of the concept of hell. And
Wow.
So we're going to be talking about how do you let go of some of these old ideas that are still carrying on. And, I'm finding even today, there are still some old leftovers from the way I would think as a believer that still interfere with my reasoning ability.
Yeah, I find that as well. I didn't have that problem because I was never a believer, at least not in the Christian tradition. I was a Taoist. That was my only true faith, which was a very different experience. But coming at it through meeting people like you, having conversations with hundreds of people in that situation, and then encountering people in my profession, academics, I find that also the methods, the way in which you decide what's true and false, the approach that you take that comes out of Christian apologetics, comes out of Christian faith traditions, that's full of a lot of bad ideas about how you do this, still gets replicated in even secular historians and scholars because they don't know that the methodologies they've absorbed come from the faith tradition and aren't really sound methods. And so they've been stripped of all the supernatural underpinning, but they're still using them. And I find that's that sort of cultural holdover is like that. And another really good big example is our gender ideology, like the sort of baseline assumptions that people have about sexuality and gender all come from biblical religion, right? Like it's like we have a very strange way of looking at things, but we take it as normal, like that's some sort of biological truth about how we're supposed to be, but it's not. It's cultural, and it's really been built over thousands of years of biblical influence in terms of what we're supposed to think. And so getting out of these traditions is hard sometimes because you've been rolling in these ruts and you've taken them for granted. You don't see, you're like the fish who doesn't see the water that they're in. And that's hard. Yeah. So it does take some work to sort of get that magic eye where you can finally, see the illusion and you're like, oh crap, and then, once it's like a eureka moment when you realize it, and then you can start to get out.
The one that really came through for me recently was I'd always been taught that the Bible is one cohesive book. And so I've always looked at it that way.
Oh yeah, that's a good example, right?
And when people started talking about the fact that when Paul was writing, the Gospels didn't exist. And that was kind of one of those eureka moments for me, like,
right.
Oh my, I've just always thought of these as a cohesive. I never thought about the fact that when he wrote this, the Gospels didn't even exist.
Yeah, and that's the order. They're the Gospels first, and then you do Paul,
right?
And you're like, oh, and then also like Matthew comes first, but Matthew actually came second, and that changes everything too. When you realize Mark is the first gospel, you really start to rethink everything. And so, anyway, yeah, we could go on and on with these examples, but yeah, these are the kinds of things that we have to figure out a way out of.
We have one more super chat we need to get to. One of my visions made me feel like I had disproved hell by going to hell.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I've read this story about this guy who claims to have had a near-death experience where he went to hell. But I have to ask, if you don't have a physical body, how can you be feeling physical pain?
Yeah. How are you seeing colors? with no cones to decide photon frequencies. You have no processor for yellow, right? Like, so like, I don't know if people realize yellow is invented by the brain using signals from two cones that do red and green. And it guesses, so we don't even have a cone for yellow. Our brain is figuring it out. So what if you don't have that circuit and you don't have cones to detect, there's no photons. So how are you seeing colors? Like why does anything have a shape or a color or whatever? Like, so like the whole out of body experience kind of thing. Like you really have to think like, well, wait a minute. Like if your body's not there, like you said, how do you feel anything? How do you see anything? Because seeing is just feeling with cones instead of like receptors in the fingers, right? Hearing is the same way. Like, how do you hear if you have no, like, if there's something has to be vibrating, what's vibrating, right? Like, and how are you detecting the vibration of sound? So, yeah, I hadn't even thought. I forget this. Like, I always forget these kinds of things. I'm glad you brought that up because that's an example of once you start thinking about it, you're like, oh, wait a minute. All the clowns start falling out of the car, and then it's kind of explodes the idea. I just did an article recently on qualia, which is why this is on the top of my head, about this very thing, that seeing, hearing, all of this is just different versions of touch. And to understand why we experience anything the way we do, you have to go back to the physics of what our body and brain are doing. But you're right. And when you take the body and brain away, like how is anything organized? Why do things have colors or make sounds? Like what does that even mean? And so, yeah, it forces you to think about those things.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you, all of you in the chat, for your comments and questions.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah. And make sure you come back next week and we'll have a nice talk with Wildman Chris. Live your life.